This episode of the Modern Therapist Survival Guide is sponsored by Buying Time.
Buying Time is a full team of virtual assistants with a wide variety of skill sets to support your business. From basic admin support, customer service, and email management to marketing and bookkeeping, they've got you covered. Don't know where to start? Check out the Systems Inventory Checklist, which helps business owners figure out what they don't want to do anymore and get those delegated ASAP. You can find that checklist at buyingtimellc.com/systems-checklist.
Listen at the end of the episode for more information.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt Widhalm and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast about all things therapist, the things that we do, the things that we run into with clients. And one of the things that is largely emerging now that the pandemic, at least at the time of the recording, seems to continue to be opening the world back up. Fingers crossed that the Delta variant doesn't shut us back down. But one of the things that many people have put off over the last 18, 20 months or so is a lot of issues facing grief. And this is an issue that one of our Therapy Reimagined 2021 speakers, Dr. Sonya Lott, is here to talk with us about today, and also at Therapy Reimagined, about helping our clients through this particular process. So thank you for coming back and spending some more time with us here on the podcast.
Absolutely. I'm really grateful to be here.
We are so glad to have you back. And I know you've answered this question before, but for new listeners or for updates for people who don't know what you're doing now, who are you and what are you putting out into the world?
I think that I am a unique emanation of a divine source, same divine source that we all are from. And I'm masquerading in a mature, full-figure, brown, beautiful body.
I love that. That is awesome.
I believe what I'm putting out in the world is a pathway to transformation after loss.
So let's jump right into this. How has the pandemic impacted the experience of people's grief and loss? And I imagine that this deals both with loved ones in the traditional grieving process, but a lot of other areas as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, the pandemic has impacted our experience of grief in that it has offered us a significant amount of death and non-death related losses. So that it means that just this pandemic, this novel virus, for the first time in our lifetimes that's led to this pandemic, we have the loss of the assumptive world, that if I do A, then B happens. It's all an illusion anyway, but in some ways it does help us get through life, and there is some truth. We have some structure. We know, when we have to be at work, when we're at home, that our family members are okay, that, all of those things are in place. And what the pandemic did, particularly when we needed to physically distance and restrict our activities to try to slow down the spread of the virus, there were a multitude of other losses that came, that no matter what I do, I might still get this virus, particularly before there was a vaccine. The loss of economic security, with jobs, the loss of physical well-being for many people, the loss of connection. We've learned to connect in ways that we didn't before, like having Zoom parties and all of that, trainings and so on. But the lack of physical touch and being present with one another has been a significant thing for all of us. So there's just a multitude of losses. And that's before even mentioning the number of people who have died as a result of the pandemic, and members who have lost families who've lost 2-3 family members in really rapid succession. There's just an overload of loss and trauma that we're all dealing with.
The piece that I heard that just really resonated with me was this idea of kind of the loss of the presumptive or assumptive word. I don't remember which word you used, but the uncertainty that became so pervasive during the pandemic was really what I felt the most. I felt like there was so much of the conversations that I had with clients, the conversations I had with friends and family was about not feeling able to plan anything, not feeling secure that physically, like I'm going to survive, my family members are going to be safe. To me, that uncertainty feels like that would be very like the cloud over the top that all of us were facing, in addition to these practical losses of graduations or conferences or weddings or trips or individuals that, and death that we experienced. Talk a little bit more maybe about this uncertainty and the feeling of loss there.
Yeah. Even for those of us who have been fortunate enough to have not experienced the death of a close loved one, we've kept our jobs. We've just had to adapt. All of those things that we haven't really suffered significant financial shifts. There is like that cloud of the uncertainty, and the doom, and the weight of that has been significant. And another thing with that is that those of us who have been fortunate or lucky really in that way, because it really is luck of the draw. Some of us have had difficulty acknowledging our losses, the loss of the assumptive world or the sense of control, because we don't feel like we have anything to grieve. People are dying over here and we're sitting here whining about, I don't know, what's going to happen next week. Yeah. So we've been, in sitting in our privilege, we've not been able to give ourselves permission to lean into whatever our loss or losses have been.
In helping people work through that, I don't know, there just seems to be so many mixed messages of society. On one hand, there's a lot of, well, you didn't lose anyone. And you're coming in here and saying, no, let's lean into that. Let's talk about what you've lost. How do you help people, and by extension, help our audience, help people deal with even just that conflictual sort of messaging that many of our clients are facing?
First, we have to name it, and work on helping people to have permission to then lead into the grief. But, anytime you lose anything of value to us, whatever it might be, there's a grief process that we really need to honor before we can move on. So I have found that naming those losses and helping people to understand that they deserve to be able to have some grief around it. Certainly not as, to the same degree as if you're dealing with a death-related grief process, you wouldn't expect that it would be that disruptive in one's day-to-day functioning, but really just giving permission and naming it. Some people don't even realize that it's loss, what they're experiencing, to know that there's a grief process, if you will. Does that make sense?
It does. It's almost kind of the dealing with kind of loss that I'm almost looking at this from kind of an attachment perspective of the loss towards, independence that either people feel supported towards early in their lives or that they get thrust upon them, that makes people kind of come back and deal with those same kinds of developments that they were either prepared for early in their life or not. And actually having to get to a place of being able to recognize it, as you're saying, name it, and then be able to deal with the feelings in response to that.
Yeah, it's not always easy to do that, but I think it really is important to. And part of the problem has been also is that to some degree we're all in dealing with loss, and so the support that we would normally have, we haven't necessarily had, or certainly not in the same way.
When I think about all of the people in my life, many of them are therapists, and then there's also family and friends who are not. And so many of the people in my life were taking care of so many people, and the weight became heavier and heavier. And there was even therapists. I think I've said this publicly. I took on extra clients. And so there was, my capacity to take care of myself, to take care of my clients, I maxed out. And so I think there have been a lot of times, and I think people are shifting now, but there have been a lot of times that there just wasn't that support. And the support that was there was also overtaxed.
Right. And also saying that you maxed out, I zoned out just a minute ago and responding also to what Curt asked around the previous loss.
I have that effect on people.
Oh, and that's why you're my favorite host.
Hey now.
But I love you, Katie.
I love you too, Sonya.
They set me up for that. But, previous loss also makes us more vulnerable to loss, particularly death-related loss. But it's an accumulation of all these losses that are happening at this time. And if we've had a history of that previously, it serves as a trigger, and it can be even more intense in trying to take it all in, name it, and have permission to try to honor, the loss, the grief around that.
So if this previous loss is one of the factors that leads people to this greater risk, what are some of these other risks that make people more vulnerable to going through this right now?
I think it makes more sense to talk about that as it relates to prolonged grief, to talk about the risk factors, because I'll talk about in terms of risk factors that make us more likely to get stuck somewhere in our grief process as it relates to dealing with the grief associated with the death of a loved one.
Let's talk prolonged grief then. What is prolonged grief? Let's start at the basics and build from there. So that way you can circle back to how this fits with kind of these additive factors that people face.
Mm-hmm. So prolonged grief is a type of grief experience that lasts for longer than 12 months. Okay, it's been at least 12 months. And it's important when we talk about it to recognize that grief in response to the death of a loved one is more than just the outward expression, maybe, tears, but it's also, grief is really all consuming. It's physical, spiritual, emotional, and cognitive. There's certain ways of thinking, survivor's guilt, feeling like if I had done this and maybe that wouldn't have happened. We might feel more fatigued, have headaches, weight gain, weight loss, question a God if we believe there is one. So grief is like all encompassing. It's more than just whether or not we're crying or really missing the person, but prolong, and we never stop missing the person. I want to be clear about that. We just learn how to allow that grief to come up, or that expression of it, and to move through it. But when a person is significantly impaired in their ability to, based on their missing, their yearning for the person, based on maybe excessive avoidance of going places where they used to go with the person, going through the person's belongings, if there is a lot of guilt or counterfactual thinking that we talk about it as, where a person's like, I should have been able to make them to go to the doctor. Or if there's guilt, in this case, if you were asymptomatic, you had COVID and you're asymptomatic, and a family member got it, and as a result, they died. So it's at least 12 months after that where these ways of thinking and feeling are still very significant or prominent, to the extent that they're interfering with your ability to function. In personal relationships, you might be more isolated, may have difficulty working if you're able really to work at all. So it's somewhere getting derailed in the process of, and I say this very tentatively, normal grief, if you will, the process of normal grief.
I was thinking about the cultural differences between grief and the grieving process. Mm-hmm. How can a therapist identify if this is a normal, in air quotes, normal grief process, and kind of how that looks for different people based on the different identities and the different cultural background that they have, versus this more prolonged grief that seems to be creating impairment? How do we know when it's a problem, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, it's the standard way, and how much it interferes with their ability to function day to day, in interpersonal relationships and work. In some cultures, like Jewish cultures, this way, there are a lot of beautiful rituals in the first year, that to allow people to mourn together, to say prayers for their loved ones, that help people to move through their grief in a way so that it's less painful. And so in those ways, those rituals where the awareness and the acknowledgement of grief goes on for some time actually help people to adapt, to reintegrate into living more fully without their loved one. So those types of rituals or cultural norms around grief are not interfering with their ability to function. It's helping them to function well. So that's the first marker in terms of whether or not, it's prolonged grief. But, there's a caveat there. If people are, and it's not so much cultural, but individual, if they are like engaging, this is one thing that happens sometimes. They're going to see medium after medium after medium after medium, spending significant amounts of money to continue to get messages from the loved one, that they may find that comforting, but that's problematic because that interferes with their ability to accept that their relationship with the person has shifted because they're no longer in a body temple, if that makes sense. Or we sometimes see where parents are more likely to do this, where if they have a young child who's died, they leave their room exactly as it was when the child was last there. The same shoes that were on the side of the bed, the same jacket that was on the door might be there 5 years later. And they're comforted by that, but that's problematic.
With some of these rituals, and especially during the pandemic, without some of those rituals that many people are accustomed to in the normal grieving process, for example, being able to attend funeral services. Are we seeing an increase in these kinds of reactions from people in this grieving process because they're not able to go through those assumptive grief sort of rituals that fit whatever culture people may be coming from?
Absolutely. That's really, really true. One of the ways that we're able to move through grief is to have people around us, people who can surround us and grieve with us. We don't grieve well in isolation. And so that's had a huge impact on our ability to grieve. I recently participated in an article in the Washington Post last December about how people David Montgomery was a reporter, but it's about how people were finding their own ways to grieve despite the limitations around, gathering together in the ways that we traditionally do. We really need each other when we're in grief. So that's one of the things that has increased the likelihood of getting into prolonged grief disorder, is not having the ability to commune with other people from the beginning of the loss, because of the need to physically distance, and also because so many other people have been overwhelmed with their own losses, like Katie, as you were saying, just maxing out and not really being available. So that's really, we can talk about that as a risk factor that increases the likelihood of prolonged grief. Another thing is, people are more likely to acquire prolonged grief if they've had that history of loss, if they had, some of these other non-death losses, so that they're really feeling overwhelmed, that they don't have the space to really deal with the overwhelming nature of the death of a loved one.
So we're looking at isolation, a loss of many things, whether it's the small day-to-day things, the certainty, and all of these things are making it more likely that folks are experiencing these prolonged grief reactions. Are there other risk factors that we should be aware of that folks maybe are starting to move out of now that we can kind of spotlight?
If people have had a history of depression, they would be more vulnerable to prolonged grief. And because of the pandemic and all the losses, people are more likely to be in depression as a result of that, even before or at the same time that someone dies. So that's another factor. People who have a loved one who die unexpectedly, and most people with COVID die unexpectedly.
Exactly.
They acquire it first and, die unexpectedly, is another risk factor. One other really huge risk factor for prolonged grief as a result of the pandemic is not being able to be with our loved ones, or not having been able to be with our loved ones when they died, having to say our last goodbyes over FaceTime or, Zoom. And like, we're not always able to be with our loved ones when they die. But when we're denied that opportunity, when perhaps we could have, it becomes more complicated, if you will, because it's more likely, the person's more likely to think, if I could have been with them, then maybe I might have noticed something and been able to let the nurses know. Or I wonder if they were afraid, if they died alone, and, not having had the chance to say what we wanted to say is a significant risk factor for prolonged grief. And that's pretty much been the standard protocol for safety reasons, but still, it's a major part of being able to adapt to that loss, is to know that we did whatever we, quote, could do. And being denied that opportunity is really significant.
How are we likely to see this continue to evolve in our clients of pandemic related grief as people are being able to kind of return back to families as health restrictions get minimized? This isn't the end of the grieving process, I'm assuming. It's not just like snapping back. So
right.
What can we expect from clients as we continue to move into the next phase of our lives?
Well, in terms of prolonged grief, again, because it's at least 12 months since the death of the loved one, we're just beginning to see that. That's just beginning to show up now. And so we're going to see more of that. But the other thing, as it relates to coming back to, quote, normal, which it's never going to be the same. A lot of people are experiencing a lot of grief coming back into, the, quote, real world. There's an awareness now of what they lost as they're coming back to what's left of it, if that makes sense. A lot of people who are being vaccinated are now experiencing grief around, if the vaccine had been available, even months before, my loved one may have lived, may have never gotten COVID, so there's loss that's associated with coming back to the, quote, real world. And for some people, seeing that it's never the same, so there's the grief around the reemergence, and some people are feeling like, I didn't mind being so isolated. I didn't mind not having to have an excuse for why I don't want to go to this particular conference or this family gathering or this work-related retreat, whatever it might be. We're still going to see loss that it's sort of like the thaw as we're coming back to the living really more fully, seeing what was lost, even though if we still have some of it, people are needing help to rise from the ashes, so to speak, and to shift from what they've lost to what's now still available to them. As it relates to grief, it's going to be really important for clinicians it's always important, but especially now, to be able to sort out what prolonged grief disorder is, which is a type of depressive disorder from major depression. And because of the conditions of the pandemic, they're coexisting more frequently now, or at least we're expecting it to. And so both need to be addressed or treated, if you will, but they're very different ways that they need to be managed. So it's really important for therapists that we do our work and learn more about what grief really is as well as what it isn't, and really be able to work with our clients now who are not in prolonged grief, but grief for whatever their situations are, the death of a loved one or non-death losses, to help to try to prevent the prolonged grief, to help them to deal with the things that we call derailers. For example, that once you experience, particularly the death of a loved one, knowing that the ways that people can get derailed from the movement through the adaptation process to loss. They can get derailed by the grief. I wish I could have done more, especially, with the pandemic, if not being able to visit with people, if they had COVID and passed it on. There is often a sense of, the isolation. People couldn't be together to grieve. That's something that could derail the movement through the grief process. So we need to be aware of all those things so that when we're working with people in the beginning, there might be question of faith, all those things in the beginning of their grief process or when they first come to us, to decrease the likelihood that they move into what we call prolonged grief disorder.
I'm I'm also hearing, and this is the lens that I put on a lot of things, but I'm also hearing things that are potentially very traumatic, especially
Mm-hmm.
with what society faced with a global pandemic, but
Mm-hmm.
also what individuals might have faced with their own loss of a loved one, or if they had other losses that felt very sudden or very traumatic to
Mm-hmm.
them. Do you have ideas around sorting that through? Because I think there's depression, there's prolonged grief, and there's trauma. And I think that all of those things may need to be addressed in different ways. And how important is it for us to tease those things out? What are your thoughts on that additional element?
Well, I think that the trauma is sort of inherent in all of the types of losses that people have experienced during the pandemic because they've been sudden, unexpected, and very significant. And so it's sort of given that it's traumatic. I think it's a safe assumption to say there's some trauma in that loss during the pandemic, even if it's the people again who didn't lose, economic security or experience the death of a loved one. So I think that, we need to deal with that also. And it's important to separate out all of the layers, but it's more difficult to separate out the different types of depressive quote disorders where the trauma it's more clear that it's separate from but integrated into a part of the full clinical picture. So there's the assumption that you're dealing with trauma, from the start. And then from there, it's a matter if it's quote normal grief, whatever. If it's acute grief, let me say that rather than normal. If there's also depression, and if there is prolonged grief or likelihood of a greater risk for prolonged grief. Does that answer?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
think there's just been so much that people have been facing. I'm even thinking about losses that were not pandemic related, but impacted
Mm-hmm.
by the pandemic. I mean, I think there's
Right.
just so much where really being able to understand your client's experience, what resources they actually had, for some folks it was kind of just this lost year, so even coming
Right.
out into the world, it seems like there are new things that they would be facing,
Mm-hmm.
and truly understanding in a different way, because there was the run, take care of yourself, take care of your kids, do everything that you need to do. And then when things kind of go back to normal, again, air quotes, I think that there's a
Right.
lot that we're experiencing and understanding differently. And there's time to start experiencing grief and understanding trauma and potentially slowing down enough to actually discern depression.
Yeah, yeah. And when we're in the traumatic experience, which has been this past year, there's often there's not, like you said, the space to even take it
Yeah.
in. You're just trying to survive emotionally,
Yeah.
and sometimes in other ways. And so it's again this thaw now. People are really having the space to sit with as we're trying to reintegrate into more full living. Yeah. And so I also want to say that as we're talking about, quote, our clients, we're talking about ourselves too. We really
Yes.
need to have the support to be able to manage all the losses we've experienced, to be able to show up for our clients in the way that they need us to be fully present. So it's a lot.
For those clients that are stuck,
Yeah.
any tips on getting them into talking about this and naming this that can help our listeners create some healing?
I think what's really important is reaching out, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a therapist. It can be a support group, but what I think is most important is that people need to know they need to find people who really understand what grief is. And I always come back to this point in podcast interviews around grief or print interviews around the myth that there are 5 stages to
Mhm.
grief. Okay. And it is a myth. The revered Elizabeth Kubler-Ross proposed it. Research has long shown that not only is it not true, stages don't exist, it's really very harmful to believe that. But there are a number of people who are very actively promoting that, and many therapists who believe that's true. So I think it's really important for people to know that that isn't true and to find places and spaces in which they can understand what grief really is, that it's probably what they're experiencing. It's not in stages. It doesn't matter. It's not that it's not linear. There are no stages. There are phases of grief. And grief is like really messy. And it's really very comprehensive physically, again, spiritually, emotionally, and cognitively. So we need to understand what grief is so we can first understand what we're experiencing to seek the support that we need. And sometimes it's just being in a relationship with other people, a support group, for example, a colleague group, or seeing a therapist. But again, a therapist who really understands what grief is as well as what it is not. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a couple of different interviews with some other grief specialists that we'll link to in the show notes that talk in more depth around how the stages don't exist.
That's so awesome. That's so awesome.
Because I think it's so important. And I feel like just to kind of our last question before we have to wrap up, and we could talk all day with you, Sonya, but I think I'm a therapist. I'm not a grief therapist, but I'm an informed therapist. I know that there's no stages. And I have a client that I feel like is getting stuck and not fully expressing their grief. What is something that I can do in my next session with them to help them open up a little bit and have some of that experience so they can start moving through?
I would say be right where they are. One of the myths that was most challenging for me to let go of is that it's really important. You really have to grieve. You really have to do this. And sometimes delayed grief is not denied grief. It's delayed because it needs to be. Or, there's no space, or may not yet be the safety around, not necessarily in their relationship with you, but within themselves and the life experiences that they've had about the vulnerability that comes with really leaning into your grief. I mean, we're like broken, we're busted wide open,
Yeah.
And so if that person isn't expressing in the ways that you're expecting or that we typically think about, at least the emotional component of grief, be right where they are, because you know that there's so much power and healing in the relationship itself. So be right there with them and allow them that space.
Where can people find out more about you and all of the wonderful things that you offer?
They can find out about me at Dr. Sonya Lott, DrSonyaLott.com. That's the easiest place to find me as it relates to my work with grief therapy.
And we will put that in very large font with a link in our show notes at nsgpodcast.com.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
You could also find Dr. Sonya at the Therapy Reimagine 2021 conference.
So excited.
That'll be September 23rd, 24th, 25th, both in Los Angeles and online wherever you may be. And check out the conference at therapyreimagineconference.com.
I want to just add one more thing that I forgot to add, that in this process, I just want to say to everybody that it's so important to practice self-compassion, to allow yourself to be where you are, to know that you're worthy of whatever grief you're experiencing, even if you weren't impacted in the ways that everybody else has been. And just, if we're trying to help other people, therapists or not, let's just try to be right where people are. That's what they need the most.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Until next time, I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy and Dr. Sonya Lott.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Buying Time.
Buying Time's VAs support businesses by managing email communications, CRM or automation systems, website admin and hosting, email marketing, social media, bookkeeping, and much more. Their sole purpose is to create the opportunity for you to focus on supporting those you serve while ensuring that your back office runs smoothly. With a full team of VAs, it gives the opportunity to hire for one role and get multiple areas of support. There's no reason to be overwhelmed with running your business with this solution available.
Book a consultation to see where and how you can get started getting the support you need. That's buyingtimellc.com/book-consultation. Once again, buyingtimellc.com/book-consultation.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.